Good evening, mates. Welcome to Historian's Lullaby, where we dive into the weirdest and most intoxicating corners of the past, this time, literally. If you enjoy these dreamy videos, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Also, please share this video with someone who you know that can't sleep because they are thinking about beer. Now, stretch your limbs, enjoy the crackling of the fire, and snuggle up with your favorite adult beverage. Tonight, we're taking a deep and possibly tipsy dive into the bubbly, boozy, and sometimes bloody history of alcohol. Our story starts in Jiahu, in what is now Henan province in China, around 1700 BC. That's right, while your ancestors were still figuring out how to use a spoon, the people of Jiahu were already fermenting rice, honey, and fruit into wine. Archaeologists found ceramic jars with chemical residues proving it. These weren't just leftovers from someone's forgotten bachelorette party. They're the earliest known alcoholic beverages on Earth. Yes, the Chinese were literally the OG brewmasters of the world. Forget Napa. Forget Bordeaux. The first sommelier? Probably an old guy squatting near the Yellow River yelling, "This vintage pairs well with roasted frog." As Chinese civilization grew, especially during the Yellow River dynasties, the drink evolved. The Zhou dynasty, which lasted between 1046 and 256 BCE, was especially obsessed with alcohol, but not in a frat party way. No, they gave it a cosmic role. You see, according to the Zhou, the reason the Xia and Shang dynasties lost the mandate of heaven wasn't inflation or tax fraud. It was drunkenness. Seriously. Zhou scribes believed their predecessors drank so much, heaven revoked their divine right to rule, which is the ancient Chinese version of getting fired for showing up to work still drunk from karaoke night. This belief wasn't just court gossip. Around 1116 BC, an edict was issued that basically said, "Drink in moderation. It's heaven's will. Also, please stop using the imperial bathtub as a wine cooler." Unlike the wine-loving folks of ancient Greece or Rome, the Chinese eventually abandoned grape wine. It's not that they didn't have grapes. They just didn't care. They were team grain all the way. By the time of the Han Dynasty, which lasted between 206 BCE and 220 CE, beer, beer, was still around but falling out of fashion. The cool kids had moved on to Huangjiu, a stronger, sweeter rice wine that could hit up to 20% ABV. It was fermented, heated, and often infused with herbs, bark, or questionable forest creatures, for medicinal purposes. And the Han elite? They drank like philosophers we the deadline. In ancient China, alcohol wasn't just for partying, it was sacred. You drank to honor the dead, to send off the living, before you went to war, and, if you were lucky, after you came back. You drank before duels, during executions, at births, weddings, funerals, and sometimes just to celebrate not dying from dysentery. The philosophers Wu Quming once wrote, "Without wine, rites are not complete." Which is ancient Chinese for, "What do you mean this funeral is dry?" Some of the greatest poets in Chinese history were absolutely sourced. Enter Li Bai, 8th century Tang dynasty poet and certified wine wizard. He once declared, "3 cups and the great Tao is mine." And legend has it he drowned while trying to embrace the moon's reflection in a river after a few too many sips. Li Bai wasn't alone. Chinese poets saw alcohol as a key to inspiration, liquid enlightenment, the loosening of language, the silken rope between human and heaven. Alcohol was the Wi-Fi connection to the divine, but like all public Wi-Fi, it didn't always work, and sometimes it just gave you a virus. Between 1100 BC and AD 1400, China enacted and repealed alcohol laws 41 times. 41. That's almost one prohibition per dynasty. And just like every other nation that's tried to ban booze, it didn't go well. A commentator in 650 BCE said it best: "People will not do without beer. To prohibit it is beyond the power even of sages." Translation: Good luck stopping a farmer from sipping his sorghum shine after a 12-hour shift. Even Confucius himself, the wise sage of order and harmony, didn't preach abstinence. He just said, "Drink, but don't fall over." Drinking in ancient China wasn't just social or spiritual, it was medicinal. Rice wine was often used in traditional Chinese medicine, infused with herbs, minerals, or things you'd rather not ask about. Think deer antler wine, scorpion wine, snake wine. It wasn't "would you like red or white?" It was "would you like your spleen balanced or your yang boosted?" Doctors claimed it could cure fatigue, restore youth, even reverse gray hair. Did it work? Maybe not. Did it get you buzzed enough to stop caring about gray hair? Absolutely. Now here's where things get potent. Sometime during the Eastern Han Dynasty, the Chinese may have independently invented distillation, the magical art of concentrating alcohol. It was probably monks or alchemists trying to create elixirs of immortality, but what they ended up with was something even better. Imagine their surprise. We were trying to transcend the flesh, and instead, we created baijiu. Today, baijiu is the world's most consumed spirit by volume, even if it smells like paint thinner left out in the sun. But it all began with early Chinese distillers, bubbling rice and wheat over low flames in search of divine secrets. By the time of Marco Polo in the 14th century, alcohol wasn't just a party favor. It was state business. He reported that grain and rice wine were consumed daily, and were one of the empire's biggest sources of income. In short, the government was making bank off buzz. Taxed, regulated, and revered, alcohol was a pillar of Chinese society, from the peasant pouring moonshine to the emperor sipping aged huangjiu in a jade goblet. And through it all, one truth remained. If you drank too much, the mandate of heaven might ghost you. So what have we learned about alcohol in the ancient world so far? The Chinese were fermenting wine before the pyramids were built. Alcohol was considered divine, poetic, medicinal, and dangerous in excess. Banning it never worked, not even when sages tried. And if you drink too much and try to hug the moon, well, you're in good company. Ancient Chinese history isn't just scrolls and sages, it's also parties, poetry, and pints. While the Yellow River shimmered with warm Huangjiu, over in the Fertile Crescent, where civilization took its first wobbly steps, something frothy was bubbling in clay pots. Something ancient. Something nutritious. Something that would change the fate of empires and fuel pyramid builders by the liter. From Sumerian temples to Egyptian tombs, from barley to bread to brew, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind. Way back. We're talking 13,000 years ago, in what is now Israel. The Natufians, a semi-nomadic people, were already fermenting a kind of beer. It was thick, porridge-like, and likely part of ritual feasts, kind of like a spiritual oatmeal party, minus the mimosas. Found in Rakfet Cave, this ancient gruel beer shows us something profound. Beer came before bread. Or maybe they came together. Either way, some ancient genius left a bowl of soggy grain out in the sun, and nature did the rest. The sun warmed the mash. Wild yeasts feasted on the sugars. Carbon dioxide fizzed. Alcohol emerged. And the first accidental hangover arrived in human history. According to author Thomas Sinclair in Beer, Bread, and the Seeds of Change, this whole fermentation business likely started as an effort to make gruel more digestible, and in doing so, our ancestors unlocked a new sacred food, beer. And they never looked back. Fast forward to around 3500 BCE, and we arrive at Sumer, the crown jewel of southern Mesopotamia. A place where writing, cities, bureaucracy, and beer all bloomed like barley in spring. In the Sumerian city of Uruk, beer wasn't just a drink, it was a currency, a ritual, a religion, and a lifestyle. Workers were literally paid in beer. You want a raise? That's 2 extra mugs of liquid bread per day. The first written beer recipe we know of? It's not in a cookbook. It's a hymn. Ladies and gentlemen, raise your goods for the hymn to Ninkasi, circa 1800 BCE. A Sumerian poem honoring the goddess of brewing, filled with lines like, "You are the one who pours out the filtered beer of the collector vat. It is like the onrush of Tigris and Euphrates." Now that's a beer commercial. Ninkasi, divine brewster, was joined by other goddesses like Ceres and Sidui, the latter appearing in the Epic of Gilgamesh as a tavern keeper offering the hero wisdom, wine, and yes, beer. And let's not forget Enkidu, the wild man, who drank 7 pitchers of beer and suddenly became very sociable. His heart grew light, his face glowed, and he sang out with joy. Fun fact, brewing was often women's work, and not in a secondary role, women were revered as the keepers of the craft. Priestesses brewed for temples. Mothers brewed for homes. And bees' sacred status flowed directly from their hands. In Sumer, you didn't just drink beer. You honored it. You invoked it. You taxed it. You regulated it. You even drank it with a straw. Yes, really. Because Sumerian beer was thick, more of a beer smoothie than an IPA, and filled with bitter solids. So they used metal straws, sometimes tipped with gold, to sip the good stuff from communal jugs. But let's talk technique. Sumerians brewed with a special ingredient, bapir, a twice-baked barley bread. You couldn't eat it. You wouldn't want to. But bapir was essential to the beer bread cycle. Here's the basic recipe, in case you want to impress your next dinner guests. First, make bapir, a hard, dry barley biscuit. Second, crumble it into water. Third, add malted grain and date syrup. Fourth, let wild yeast work its funky magic. And finally, strain it. Drink it. Sing to Ninkasi. Sumerians also learned that reusing the same fermentation pot gave better results, because it kept a living culture of yeast and bacteria inside the clay walls. In other words, they invented the starter culture thousands of years before sourdough TikTok. They carried their brewing pots like magical relics. Because they were. And the Code of Hammurabi? Yeah, that ancient law book from Babylon in 1750 BCE. It had regulations for tavern keepers. If a tavern keeper does not accept grain as payment, death. Suddenly that expired beer in your fridge seems less tragic. Now let's sail southwest, down the Nile, into the golden glow of ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, pharaohs, and some of the most dedicated beer drinkers in human history. In Egypt, beer wasn't just a drink, it was a national obsession. Evidence of large-scale brewing goes back over 5,000 years, and in 2021 archaeologists uncovered a massive beer factory in Abydos dating to the reign of King Nama, one of Egypt's earliest rulers. This place could churn out thousands of liters of beer at once. And we're not talking modern-day light lagers, we're talking thick, nutritious, porridge-like brews, made from baked barley loaves and sweetened with dates. So vital was beer that pyramid workers were paid in it 4 to 5 liters per day, to be exact. It wasn't just refreshment, it was calories, hydration, motivation, and divine blessing in liquid form. No, the pyramids weren't built by aliens. They were built on bricks and beer. In Egypt, beer wasn't just for living. It came with you to the afterlife. Tombs are filled with beer jars, models of brewers at work, and hieroglyphic recipes. Why? Because the soul still gets thirsty. Even gods needed a cold one, or at least a room temp one, since refrigerators were still a few millennia away. Beer was also central to religious rituals. Temples brewed beer as offerings to the gods. Priests blessed it. And during one particularly wild myth, beer saved the world. Here's the story. The goddess Atha, cow-headed and wrathful, was on a rampage to destroy humanity. The other gods, terrified, poured beer mixed with the psychoactive plant mandrake, dyed red to look like blood, across the fields. Sekhmet drank it all, passed out, and woke up with no memory of her murder spree. Beer literally saved civilization. Atha, 0, hangover, 1. There's a blurry line between bread and beer in the ancient world, and the Egyptians danced all over it. Barley was baked into loaves, then crumbled into mash, fermented, strained, and consumed with gusto. In fact, some scholars argue that beer might have come before bread entirely. It was easier to digest. It sanitized water. And it delivered precious calories and vitamins, including B-complex nutrients, which is why beer was sometimes called liquid bread. And let's be honest, if it's between a stale barley loaf and a frothy jug of date-sweetened ale, I know what I'm reaching for. Much like in China, ancient Middle Easterners believed beer had healing powers. It was used to treat everything from stomach cramps to depression. And honestly, with that much vitamin B and that little clean water, they might have been right. But beer wasn't just medical, it was social, sacred, and surprisingly feminist. In Sumer and Babylonia, the vast majority of brewers were women. Not as helpers. As professionals. Brewing was one of the only professions in Mesopotamia with divine protection from female deities. There was the already mentioned Ninkasi, goddess of brewing, Sidui, goddess of enjoyment, and Ceres, who literally became a nickname for beer itself. They were respected. Until, of course, the patriarchy got involved. Later on, beer brewing shifted toward male-dominated guilds. But for thousands of years, beer was woman-made and goddess-approved. The beer bug spread far and wide. In ancient Armenia, Xenophon in the 5th century BCE wrote of barley wine served in giant bowls, with reeds for sipping. A sort of ancient hookah lounge, but with beer instead of tobacco. He said the drink was strong and delicious to certain palates. Translation: you'll need a few tries, and maybe some bread. In India, beer-like drinks called sura were part of the Vedic tradition. Gods drank it. So did mortals. It wasn't just intoxicating, it was divine. That's right, if you thought ancient India was all yoga, meditation, and ascetic sages surviving on air and enlightenment, let's crack open another cold one. Because long before lagers and kingfishers, the gods were sipping on sura, tribal brewers were fermenting rice into sacred offerings, and elephant gangs were raiding villages to chug beer like it was Coachella. Let's briefly step into the Vedic age, around 1500 to 500 BCE, when India's earliest religious texts were compiled, and sura was already making headlines in the cosmos. Sura, a beer-like drink, probably made from barley, rice, or millet, appears all over the Rig Veda, the oldest of the Vedas. And who loved it most? Not a humble farmer. not a rebellious sage, but the king of the gods himself, Indra. That's right. Indra, the thunder-wielding storm god, didn't just chug Sura, he absolutely relied on it to slay demons. One verse tells us, he drank a full ocean of Sura and burst the belly of Vritra. I mean, have you ever had so much beer you burst a snake demon? But wait, wasn't Vedic India all about spiritual purity? Yes and no. While Soma, a sacred, likely entheogenic plant-based elixir, got the spiritual spotlight, Sura was its earthier, boozier cousin. Soma lifted your soul. Sura made you shout karaoke at a yak sacrifice. Even the Ramayana mentioned Sura, and not just as a passing vice. Queens, warriors, and sages all partook. This was a time when divine intoxication was part of the cosmic drama. And now we skip ahead to the Mauryan Empire, around 300 BCE, and we meet a very serious man, Kautilya, also known as Chanakya, ancient India's answer to Machiavelli with a bigger beard and sharper pen. In his legendary treatise, the Arthashastra, Kautilya writes about alcohol regulation. Yes, even back then, there were government-run liquor stores. He mentions two intoxicating rice-based beverages, Midaka and Prasana. These were your ancient Indian beer variants, made by fermenting grains with herbs, possibly sweetened, maybe even carbonated if the gods were feeling generous. And Kautilya? He was not here for happy hour. The superintendent of liquor shall establish liquor shops. That's right. The state controlled alcohol production and collected taxes on it, naturally. Some things never change. But even with regulation, beer remained embedded in daily life, whether for ceremony, celebration, or medicinal use. Yes, beer was medicine, and not just for your hillbilly uncle. While the big empires had royal breweries, the real legacy of ancient Indian beer lives on in the tribes. Across eastern and central India, in places like Jharkhand, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, and beyond, indigenous communities have been making rice beer for thousands of years. They call it handia. It's made by fermenting boiled rice with natural herbs, sometimes including Ruellia fruticosa, for flavor and fermentation. And it's not a hobby. It's a ritual. Among the Asia people, for example, rice beer is used in ceremonies, from marriage to mourning, harvest to healing. It's poured to honor the ancestors, shared to mark transitions, and brewed in large batches, often by women, who pass recipes through generations like sacred mantras. Some tribes also brew millet beer using grains like finger millet or sorghum. It's thicker, tangier, and yes, still powerful enough to get the village dancing. And here's a fun fact courtesy of biologist J.B.S. Haldane. He argued that tribal beer actually protected communities from beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin B1 deficiency. Because rice beer, rich in B vitamins from fermentation, wasn't just tasty, it was nutritional medicine. So next time someone tells you beer has no health benefits, point them to 3,000 years of Ayurvedic happy hours. Of course, not everyone's been a fan of the brew. In modern times, social workers and state officials have tried to curb tribal alcohol use, citing addiction, poverty, and social issues. And while these efforts often come from a place of concern, they've sparked controversy around cultural autonomy versus state control. But ancient India had its share of beer-related drama too. Take Megasthenes, the Greek ambassador to Chandragupta's court. He recorded that Indians drank rice beer regularly, and while the elites were more wine-inclined, the common folk loved their local brews. And then there's the wildest entry in this story. Elephant beer raids. Yes, seriously. In regions where rice beer is still brewed outdoors, in pots, drying under the sun, elephants have been known to sniff it out and party. Entire herds of wild elephants have been documented raiding villages just to slurp down handir. And not just a sip. These elephants drink enough to get visibly drunk, stumble around, knock over huts, and occasionally start fights with trees. Apparently, they've developed a taste for it, and once they get a whiff, no fence or festival is safe. Truly, nothing says local popularity like a fan base of intoxicated pachyderms. Back in the ancient day, drinking wasn't always recreation. It was often spiritual. Sura, like its cousin Soma, had a place in ritual sacrifice and religious ceremony. Whether as an offering to deities, a sacrament among sages, or a festive drink during royal rituals, it wasn't uncommon for gods and mortals to toast together. In many tribal traditions, beer is still offered to ancestors, consumed during harvest festivals like Sahul or Karma, used in healing rituals, where it's seen as both a purifier and protector. Even the brewing process itself, from choosing grains to fermenting with wild herbs, is done with reverence. For ancient India, beer wasn't just a beverage. It was a bridge between worlds, sacred and profane, life and death, human and divine. And sometimes, just a way to get through another monsoon. Ancient India had a rich, diverse, and deeply spiritual beer culture, from Sura-loving storm gods to tribal brewers whose traditions still survive today. It wasn't industrial. It wasn't bottled. But it was powerful, personal, and profoundly tied to culture, health, and ceremony. In fact, while wine often gets the glamour and Soma gets the mystery, beer was the people's drink, warm, earthy, and bursting with stories. And elephants. Definitely elephants. So before moving on, let's raise our glasses to Indra and his Sura, the tribal grandmothers of India, and to that one elephant who just really needed a drink. But there is still more ancient beer brewers waiting to be discovered. So sit still as we distill the ancient brewing and drinking practices of ancient Greece. When you think of ancient Greece, you probably picture golden goblets overflowing with wine, toga-clad philosophers slurring Socratic dialogues, and Dionysus leading a conga line of maenads across the Aegean. But what if I told you that, buried deep beneath all that grape-soaked glory, was a secret barley brew? That's right, the Greeks had beer. They just didn't really want you to know about it. Because to them, beer was for barbarians, the northern folks who wore pants and didn't know a proper symposium from a backyard kegger. But here's the twist. Archaeological evidence proves that beer was brewed, consumed, and possibly even celebrated in ancient Greece, long before Plato could wag a wine-scented finger at the north. Our journey begins in northern Greece, around 4,000 years ago, in the early Bronze Age, before Athens, before Sparta, before that one weird guy who carved all the abs into statues. At the site of Archendico, archaeologists uncovered something intoxicating. Burned-down ruins of a prehistoric home revealed dozens of charred cereal grains, hidden and preserved beneath layers of time and ash. What kind of grains? Einkorn wheat. Emma, otherwise called Triticum dicarchum. And everyone's favorite fermentable, barley, Hordeum vulgare. These grains weren't just sitting there. They were sprouted, a telltale sign of malting, the first step in beer production. You don't sprout your grain unless you've got bigger plans for it. Like, say, getting buzzed. And the clincher? Archaeologists found a two-chambered oven, capable of sustaining 100 degrees Celsius temperatures, ideal for mashing grain into fermentable sugars. Right next to it, about 30 specially shaped ceramic cups, just waiting to host an ancient toast. A little farther south, at Agrissa, the pattern repeats. This time, German archaeologists in the 1950s uncovered 3,588 sprouted grains, most of them einkorn. A heating structure suspiciously similar to the one at Archendico. And a whopping 45 distinct drinking vessels. It's like someone set up a Bronze Age microbrewery, then left the taps running before bailing in a fire. So, what we have here is not just a one-off coincidence. It's a regional culture of beer production, one that predates classical Greece by over 1,000 years. Fast forward to classical Greece, and beer? Let's just say it had a bit of a branding problem. To the Greeks of the 5th century BCE, beer was uncivilized. The drink of barbarians. Northerners. Thracians. People who wore trousers. According to Herodotus, the Egyptians made beer from barley, a fact stated with a kind of anthropological cringe. And while beer was still known in the Greek world, especially through trade with Egypt, Thrace, and Mesopotamia, it wasn't cool. The Greeks identified culturally with wine, which was civilized, elegant, proper for symposia, where men drank and discussed philosophy while lying on expensive couches. Not, fermented porridge. Even the word for beer, zythos, borrowed from the Egyptians, barely shows up in Greek literature. So, were the Greeks really so wine exclusive? Here's the punchline: they weren't. In practice, many Greek colonies, especially in the north and around the Black Sea, probably drank beer regularly. After all, grapes didn't grow well everywhere, and local grains were abundant. Even Greek historians and doctors like Dioscorides and Galen discussed barley beer as a medicinal beverage, useful for digestion and hydration. Sure, they were kind of judgy about it, but it was in the scrolls. And here's the kicker, the Romans would later go full throttle into beer production during colder expansions, borrowing from both Germanic and Thracian styles. We'll get to the Romans a little later. So the Greeks may have talked the wine talk, but they probably sipped beer on the side like it was an ancient guilty pleasure. At the top of society, wine ruled. You went to a symposium, you sipped diluted wine from elegant craters, and you waxed poetic about logos while someone played the orlos. But everyday folks, rural peasants, farmers, grain traders, and temple workers probably had a more flexible palate. And let's not forget that religion sometimes had a place for beer too. While Dionysus was the god of wine and theatre in older regional cults, he also had associations with grain fermentation and intoxication in general. Maybe, just maybe, there was a rural Dionysian rite with barley beer instead of wine. And no one wrote it down because the wine people got to the scrolls first. So why didn't ancient Greek beer take off the way it did in China, Sumer, or Egypt? Simple answer: climate and culture. Grapes grew easily in southern Greece. Wine stored and traveled better. Wine had religious significance in mystery cults, especially Dionysus. And the Greeks loved a good cultural superiority complex. But beer didn't disappear. It persisted in the background, whispered in cups from Thessaly to Thrace, bubbling quietly in rural homes and borderlands. And we know this because the Bronze Age breweries show pre-Hellenic production. The term zythos survived, and Byzantine and modern Greek records mention continued beer brewing well into the later centuries. So the next time someone tells you beer was never a Greek thing, offer them a cold one, and a 4,000-year-old archaeological citation. When you think of ancient Rome, what do you picture? Marble columns, legions marching, senators scheming, and of course, goblets overflowing with deep red wine, but beer. In the Roman Empire? Let's just say, the cold ones didn't exactly get a warm welcome. In fact, calling someone a beer drinker in ancient Rome was practically a slur. But beer still existed. It lurked in the shadows of civilization. In border forts, among the barbarians, and in dusty corners of Roman kitchens where grapes didn't grow. To the ancient Romans, wine was life. It was medicine. It was ritual. It was social glue. It was practically a civilizational requirement. From the most exalted emperor to the humblest farmer, Romans drank wine like modern people drink coffee, constantly, communally, and sometimes irresponsibly, and above all, they drank wine because it was Roman beer. On the other hand, like their Greek predecessors, the Romans felt that beer was for barbarians. People from the chilly, grape-free zones of Gaul, Germania, and Britannia, people who didn't build aqueducts or discuss Cicero at dinner. So let's be clear, beer existed in the empire. But to many Romans, it was about as classy as drinking out of a shoe. The Roman word for beer was cerevisia, named after Ceres, goddess of agriculture. We see this linguistic holdover in the Spanish word for beer, cerveza. So it's not that they didn't have a word for it. They just didn't want to use it unless they had to. The Romans wrote about beer like it was a moldy loaf in liquid form. Tacitus, the Roman historian, described Germanic beer as a horrible brew fermented from barley or wheat, a far cry from the civilized flavors of wine. Say what you will, Tacitus, but at least they weren't mixing dolphin intestines into their garum sauce. Let's leave the judgmental Roman senators behind and head to the edges of the empire, specifically Vindolanda, a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. Here, archaeologists discovered something amazing: the Vindolanda tablets, wooden writing fragments that give us a real glimpse into Roman military life. One such tablet? A soldier named Masculus writing to his commander. My fellow soldiers ask whether they might have beer. The supply has run out. That's right. These Roman troops stationed in Britannia weren't asking for wine. They wanted beer. Why? Because grapes don't grow in rainy, misty, sheep-infested Britain. But grains? Oh, there's plenty of that. So the legions adapted. They drank beer when wine was scarce. They learned brewing techniques from local Celtic tribes. And honestly, they probably didn't hate it. So even if Rome didn't celebrate beer, it depended on it in the fringes of empire. While Rome's elite gushed about vintage Falernian wines, the lower classes drank what they could afford. And beer, cheap, easy to brew, and full of calories, was often the answer. In crowded cities like Rome, Ostia, and Pompeii, beer may have been brewed in small-scale kitchens or back-alley taverns, especially in immigrant neighborhoods where Egyptian, Gallic, or Syrian customs survived. There's even medical literature from Roman doctors like Dioscorides and Galen that mentions beer, praising it, with mild disdain, for the digestive aid, treating diarrhea, and hydrating workers. It wasn't glamorous. But it worked. And let's not forget that beer has B vitamins and was often safer than water in ancient cities. So while senators might swirl their wine and quote Virgil, Roman workers might have clinked clay mugs of barley brew after hauling marble blocks for 10 hours. Can you imagine building the Colosseum without a post-shift pint? One of the great ironies of Roman beer history is that foreigners made a lot of it. Women, especially, in many Celtic, Egyptian, and Near Eastern cultures, women dominated brewing. In fact, beer production was often home-based, community-rooted, and handled by wives, mothers, priestesses, and healers. The Romans, to their credit, imported beer-like beverages from these regions, sometimes even using them in religious or military contexts. And in cities where grain was plentiful but grapes weren't, beer became an economic necessity. In short, beer didn't vanish. It just hid behind the curtains while wine hogged the spotlight. Fast forward to the decline of the Roman Empire, and something curious begins to happen. As Christianity spreads and the Western Roman world collapses, beer gets a second chance. Why? Because monks, especially in Gaul and Germania, started brewing beer in monasteries. Not for parties, but for nutrition, hospitality, and fundraising. And while this was technically after Rome's classical period, it shows how beer, once sneered at by senators, was slowly becoming respectable again. It's the ultimate Roman plot twist. Beer goes from barbarian swamp water to blessed monk brew in just a few centuries. So why didn't the Romans ever go full beer nerd? Some theories, climate and geography. Italy is perfect for grapes, not barley-heavy beer cultures. Cultural prestige. Wine was tied to civilization, intellect, and religion. Snobbery. Let's be real, elite Romans loved to feel superior. Storage limitations. Beer spoiled faster in warm climates before advanced brewing techniques. Propaganda. Rome marketed wine as Roman, beer as foreign, even though both had ancient roots. But whatever the reasons, beer survived. Through soldiers, slaves, immigrants, monks, and poor people with a taste for something hearty and bubbly. And eventually, it would rise again in medieval taverns, Renaissance guilds, and eventually your local gastropub. Well, that last sentence just slid us nicely into the Middle Ages, didn't it? A time of monks and monarchs, plague and piety, and a whole lot of beer. Now, you may have heard that medieval people drank beer because the water was poison. Not quite. That's the kind of oversimplified history that goes down about as smooth as day-old mead. In truth, medieval beer was more than just liquid bread. Like other civilizations we have already explored, it was economy, medicine, religion, and, yes, sometimes an excuse to start a brawl before dinner. So buckle your belt, polish your pewter mug, and prepare for a rip into the bubbly belly of the Middle Ages' favorite fermented friend, beer. Picture Europe around the year 800. The Carolingian Empire is booming, monasteries are spreading, and some guy named Adelard of Corbie is writing about a plant called hops. Yes, in 822 CE, this monk notes the flavoring and preserving properties of hops in beer. A major milestone in your future IPA obsession. But before hops took over the brew scene, beer was flavored with groot, a mysterious mix of herbs like yarrow, wild rosemary, bog myrtle, and whatever else looked vaguely edible and didn't kill the brewer last time. In the north and east of Europe, where grapevines refused to grow and winters lasted 6 centuries, okay, slight exaggeration, beer was the beverage of choice, consumed daily by peasants and nobles alike. Not because water was unsafe, but because beer was hearty, delicious, sometimes, and calorie-dense. It filled your belly and masked the taste of a diet that mostly consisted of porridge and disappointment. And who brewed the beer? Like in the past, women. Lots of women. In fact, beer brewing was a domestic task, passed from mother to daughter like sourdough starter and passive-aggressive life advice. The male wife was a staple of the medieval village, brewing beer in the home and selling it from her doorway. Alewives controlled a significant part of the local economy, and a good brewer could make a tidy profit. But they had competition. Enter the monks, medieval Europe's spiritual multitaskers. When they weren't praying, copying manuscripts, or making cheese, they were brewing beer and getting very good at it. Why? Because beer was nutrition in a glass. During Lent, when solid food was verboten, monks drank liquid bread, rich, bready beer packed with calories, nutrients, and just enough alcohol to make the choir sound heavenly. Monasteries began perfecting the process by standardizing recipes, using hops for preservation, aging beer in barrels, not just cauldrons, and eventually brewing on a scale big enough to sell to the surrounding community. And thus, the modern beer industry was born in the monastic taprooms of medieval Europe. Blessed be the brew. Let's clear something up. In medieval England, ale and beer were not the same thing. Ale was composed of water, malt, and yeast. Beer was made of water, malt, yeast, and hops. This led to some serious drama. In 15th century England, the Brewers' Company of London insisted no hops, herbs, or other like thing be put into any ale or liquor. Basically, keep your fancy continental weeds out of our pure British brew. A popular 16th century ale defender wrote, "Ale for an Englishman is a natural drink. Beer is a cold drink. It make a man fat, and doth inflate the belly, as it doth appear by the Dutch." So yes, beer was considered foreign, fattening, and suspicious by English ale purists. But it preserved longer. It travelled better. It didn't spoil in a week. And slowly, hop beer began to take over. By the High Middle Ages, beer had found its way out of the kitchen and into the tavern. Public houses, inns, and brew halls popped up across Europe, not just as places to drink, but as community hubs. You might hear the latest gossip, make a shady business deal, hire a mercenary, complain about taxes, recite some bad poetry, or accidentally get married. Yes, alehouse marriages were a thing. And the beer? It came in wooden mugs, ceramic cups, and leaky barrels, often ladled out by a barkeep who might or might not know what sanitation means. Beer varied by region. Germany perfected its hop beer. The Low Countries innovated with malt. England stuck to its ale. And in Scandinavia, beer was practically currency. Beer became a cornerstone of urban life, and by the late Middle Ages, commercial brewing was booming. But not everyone was toasting the rise of beer. Medieval physicians, especially those educated in Greek or Arab traditions, often disliked beer, mostly because they didn't understand it. One 13th century Italian doctor, Aldo Brandino of Siena, wrote, "Whether made from oats, barley, or wheat, it harms the head and stomach, causes bad breath and ruins the teeth, fills the stomach with fumes, but it makes one's flesh white and smooth. So it gives you gas and acne, but also radiant skin. Thanks, Doc. Still, beer was widely prescribed as a remedy for digestive issues, as a diuretic, for women in childbirth. Monks even brewed special medicinal beers with herbs for the sick. And while beer wasn't as respected as wine, it was still safer than many contaminated water sources, especially in cities. As beer demand rose, so did the beer business. By the 14th and 15th centuries, brewing had become guild-controlled, heavily taxed, and regulated with obsessive detail. In cities like Nuremberg, Bruges, and London, brewing licenses were required, and standardized barrel sizes were enforced. No more shady street alewives selling mystery malt out the back door. Well, fewer of them, at least. And it paid off. By the late Middle Ages, beer exports surged across the Baltic and North Seas. German beers traveled in standardized casks. Dutch ships carried beer as ballast. English beer became a political issue. Beer wasn't just a drink. It was an industry, one that phoned with international influence. By the dawn of the Renaissance, beer had transformed. What started as a rustic household joy had become a global commodity, religious staple, an urban necessity. Alewives and monks gave way to commercial breweries. Taverns gave way to pubs. Grute gave way to hops. And beer, once considered crude and barbaric, had become Europe's drink of the people, a liquid legacy that still froths in pint glasses around the world. But with its popularity came economic issues. And those economic issues resulted in the first beer law on record. Specifically in Germany, long before Oktoberfest and frosty pint glasses of Pilsner, before IPAs and banana-scented Hefeweizens, there was a law. A beer law. A serious, scroll-unfurling, monk-nodding, duke-decreed law. It was called the Reinheitsgebot, the Bavarian beer purity law of 1516. And this legendary decree said that beer could only contain water, barley, hops, and later, yeast, but we'll get to that. No coriander. No fruit. No chili peppers or lactose or marshmallow fluff. Just water, grain, and a bitter herb that doubles as nature's preservative. But where did this law come from? Why was it passed? And why does it still matter 5 centuries and 10 billion liters later? Our story begins in Bavaria, the land of alpine mountains, lederhosen, and beer gardens big enough to host a battle of the bands and a political debate at the same time. It's 1516. Martin Luther is about to nail his grievances to a church door. The Renaissance is getting weird. And in Bavaria, Duke Wilhelm IV has something else on his mind. Beer quality. Because back then, beer wasn't always safe. Brewers were adding everything from sawdust, stale bread, tree bark, animal parts, and let's not forget the occasional handful of poison herbs. Why? For flavor, preservation, or to strengthen the brew. And people were getting sick, or worse, offended by bad-tasting beer, which in Bavaria was basically the same thing. So on April 23, 1516, Wilhelm issued a decree. In all our towns and markets, nothing else shall be used for beer than barley, hops, and water. Simple. Elegant. Fermented. Let's break down the original ingredients list like a medieval Gordon Ramsay. 1. Water. Fair enough. Clean water equals better beer equals fewer funerals. 2. Barley. This is key. Not just grain, barley, specifically. Why? Because wheat and rye were needed for bread. Bread fed the poor. Beer fed the thirsty. But bread won the economic argument. So barley got the beer slot. It was hearty, high in enzymes, and less essential to food security. Also, it just tasted right. 3. Hops. The botanical hero. Hops added bitterness, flavor, and most importantly, preservation. Before refrigeration, hops were the difference between a pleasant buzz and a liquid penicillin experiment gone wrong. And what's missing? Yeast. Because in 1516, nobody knew yeast existed. Fermentation was magic. Beer just happened. Yeast wouldn't be discovered until Louis Pasteur said, "Surprise! It's alive," in the 1800s. At that point, the Reinheitsgebot was updated to make yeast official. Was the Reinheitsgebot really about protecting public health? Yes, and also taxes. You see, regulating beer wasn't just about keeping out questionable herbs, it was about standardizing production, controlling prices, and making sure dukes got their cut. The law even set price limits for beer. 1 pfennig per liter in winter. 2 in summer, because brewing was harder. It also helped crack down on wheat hoarders, since wheat beer was considered a decadent luxury, the IPA of its day. So yes, the Reinheitsgebot was part health code, part market control, and part PR campaign. Because nothing says strong leadership like pretending to protect the people while securing your own supply of crispy lagers. Now, here's where things get funky. Literally most medieval beers were top fermented. That means at warm temperatures, yeast that floats, fruity, spicy flavors, and a short shelf life. But then, in some chilly Bavarian caves, something unexpected happened. Brewers left their beer in cool cellars for months, and it didn't spoil. In fact, it got crisp, clean, and smooth. Enter bottom fermentation. This yeast settled at the bottom and thrived in cool temps, leading to what we now call lagers. Was this science? Nope. It was a lucky accident, like inventing cheese by forgetting milk in a steel bag. But Bavarian brewers leaned in, and eventually, lagers dominated the market. So while the Reinheitsgebot didn't start as a lager law, it became the spiritual home of clean, bottom-fermented beer. Jump forward to 1871. Germany is unified under Otto von Bismarck, who's great at two things. Realpolitik, a political approach that emphasizes practical considerations and national interests over ideological or moral principles. And apparently, keeping the beer pure. The Reinheitsgebot, originally Bavarian, is now applied across the German Empire. Suddenly, every beer is a Reinheitsgebot beer, or its suspect. This nationalization turns the Reinheitsgebot from a regional regulation into a global symbol of German brewing. It becomes part of the German identity, like sausages, punctual trains, and skeptical customer service. And in the 20th century, when global beer brands start adding corn syrup, rice, fruit juice, and questionable or natural flavors, the Reinheitsgebot stands tall like a noble, slightly buzzed paladin of purity. Okay, let's talk truth. Is the Reinheitsgebot the oldest food regulation still in use? Well, kind of yes, it's very old. Yes, it influenced centuries of brewing, but it also evolved, got repealed, and wasn't always enforced equally. In fact, it left out yeast until the 1800s, because we didn't know yeast existed until the 1800s. It banned wheat beers, which later made a huge comeback. And it was officially removed from EU law in 1987 after trade complaints. Thanks, Belgium, for pointing out that your delicious fruit beers deserve to cross borders too. Still, many German brewers today voluntarily follow the Reinheitsgebot, proudly labeling their beers with brewed according to the purity law of 1516. It's become a badge of quality, even if modern beer science has moved far beyond it. But not everyone loves the Reinheitsgebot. Critics say it's outdated, restrictive, and bad for creativity. Others claims that the law stifles innovation and limits Germany's participation in the global craft beer renaissance, but defenders argue that it preserves tradition, ensures clean beer, and keeps marketing honest. You may not get a blueberry mocha imperial milkshake sour. But what you do get is consistent, balanced, and unapologetically beer-flavored beer. So why does the Reinheitsgebot still matter? Because it represents the origins of food regulation. The intersection of science, politics, and taste. And the eternal human question, what is beer? It's about more than ingredients. It's about identity, pride, and the weird, wonderful way history bubbles up into our modern pint glasses. So whether you're sipping a hazy IPA brewed with passion fruit and glitter, or a crisp Bavarian Helles brewed according to the law of 1516, take a moment to appreciate the long, sudsy road that brought you here. In the end, the Reinheitsgebot is many things a medieval food safety rule, a nationalist beer branding tool, a controversial relic of tradition, and a conversation starter for beer nerds everywhere. It helped shape one of the world's most respected brewing cultures. It made lager a global phenomenon. And it still gives us something to debate over our third round. And the evolution of beer doesn't end there. Welcome now to the Industrial Revolution. A time of coal, gears, soot, smog, and surprise. Some of the most radical changes in beer history. While cities grew smoky and machines grew noisy, beer got cleaner, crisper, and way less smoky, which, if you ask anyone who's ever tried 17th century West Country ale, was a blessing. From steam-powered breweries to Louis Pasteur's laboratory, the 18th and 19th centuries weren't just an age of invention, they were a golden, frothy age of beer innovation. Let's clatter our way through the Industrial Revolution, one pint at a time. As we have already seen, before the Industrial Revolution, brewing was, let's say, rustic. Beers were often brewed at home or in small batches by local alewives or taverns, using wood-fired kilns, smoke-stained malts, and more trial and error than actual measurement. And here's the kicker: the beer was often smoky and not in a cool, barrel-aged, artisanal way. More like, I left my barley in a bonfire energy. Texts from the 1500s to 1700s, like William Harrison's description of England, tell us about wood-dried malt annoying the head and giving the beer an ill taste only locals could stomach. By 1700, people were trying to minimize the smoke, using straw, fern, or coke-n, that ethic kind of coke. This instead was a form of purified coal, instead of regular firewood. Still, flavor control was basically a guessing game. Enter the Age of Enlightenment, where nerds were finally cool, and science was the new religion. Two simple tools revolutionized brewing forever: the thermometer, introduced in brewing in 1760, and the hydrometer, which arrived in 1770. With the thermometer, brewers could finally control mash temperatures, crucial for enzyme activity and sugar extraction. Before this, they just guessed. Stick your elbow in and hope for the best. With the hydrometer, brewers could measure how much sugar was in the wort, and therefore how strong the beer would be. But it did more than that. It exposed the dirty little secret of malt. Pale malt, more expensive, gave 80 pounds of sugar extract per quarter, while brown malt, cheaper, used for porter, only gave 54 pounds. And just like that, pale malt became the golden child of beer efficiency. Suddenly, instead of making brown beer from brown malt, brewers just used pale malt and added a little roasted malt for color. Efficiency, consistency, control. The hallmarks of industrial age brewing. Then came James Watt's 1765 steam engine improvements. And just like that, beer went from cottage craft to factory-scale production. Now, steam could pump water, stir giant vats, power malt mills, drive bottling lines, and even heat kettles evenly without open fires. Breweries became multi-story powerhouses, with gravity-fed systems moving beer from top-floor mash tuns down to fermentation cellars. Places like London, Burton-upon-Trent, and Dublin built sprawling beer factories, entire neighborhoods smelling like wort and ambition. And production? It exploded. From tiny town batches to hundreds of barrels per day, beer was no longer just local, it was shippable, exportable, industrial. You could say the beer world got steamed. No beer embodies the Industrial Revolution more than porter. Born in early 18th century London, porter was dark, strong, and cheap, perfect for the working-class men who hauled goods at the city's docks. Hence the name, porter. It was brewed in massive quantities, aged in huge wooden vats, hopped generously to last months, and eventually exported across the empire. But it had a problem: color. Remember how hydrometers made brewers switch to pale malt for efficiency? Well, in 1816, a British law said only malt and hops could be used in beer. No sugar, no colorants, no black treacle. So when porter brewers needed a legal way to darken beer made mostly from pale malt, along came Daniel Wheeler and the drum roaster. In 1817, a man named Daniel Wheeler invented the drum roaster. It worked like a coffee roaster, allowing malt to be roasted dark, evenly, and smokelessly. With it, he created patent malt, a very dark malt that could be added in small amounts to pale malt beer to achieve the deep brown-black color of porter and stout. This changed the game. You didn't need to use inefficient brown malt anymore. Just brew with pale malt for efficiency. Add a little roast malt for color. And boom! Authentic tasting porter, industrial style. Wheeler's invention saved the porter industry and paved the way for modern stouts, including that little brewery in Dublin you may have heard of, Guinness. And now, let's talk about something you can't see, but your stomach appreciates. Yeast. Until the 19th century, fermentation was considered magic. Brewers reused their yeast or relied on airborne wild strains, and sometimes the beer turned out great. Other times, it turned into sour soup with bubbles. But in 1857, a Frenchman named Louis Pasteur made a discovery that rocked the beer world. Fermentation is caused by living organisms, yeasts, and contamination by other microbes spoils beer. He even wrote a book, Studies on Beer, a love letter to science and lager. Brewers took note. They began cultivating pure yeast strains, sterilizing equipment, monitoring hygiene. Pasteur's findings laid the foundation for modern microbiology and rescued millions of barrels from accidental vinegarification. So next time your beer doesn't smell like foot cheese, thank science. It is now the middle 1800s. You've got the tech. You've got the yeast. You've got the pale malts and the roasted malts and the big copper kettles. Now you need a way to deliver that liquid gold. Enter glass bottles. In 1912, the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company in Milwaukee introduced brown glass beer bottles, a game changer. Why brown? Because sunlight ruins beer. UV rays cause a reaction that makes your brew smell like a skunk's butthole. Brown glass filters UV light, keeping the beer fresh, stable, and less skunky. Soon, it became the global standard for bottling beer, a humble detail that helped bring beer out of the barrel and onto grocery shelves worldwide. By the late 19th century, industrial brewing had gone global. Breweries used steam engines, hydrometers, pure yeast strains, refrigeration, filtration, bottling lines. From Burton-upon-Trent to Boston, from Prague to Tokyo, beer became cleaner, cheaper, more consistent, and more available than ever before. Lager became king. Porter held strong. Pale ale rose in the UK. And brewing families like Anheuser, Guinness, Heineken, and Carlsberg built beer empires with train tracks and yeast cultures. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change beer. It standardized it, scaled it, and made it global. And every cold one you enjoy today, from craft to macro brew, carries the fingerprints of 19th century science and steam. So may we pour a little out for the inventors, tinkerers, and mustachioed gearheads who made it possible. They turned beer from a folk tradition into a global powerhouse. They turned smoky mash into crisp lagers. And they made sure that, even in the most soot-choked industrial cities, you could still find something golden, bubbly, and absolutely worth drinking. Beer. It's older than sliced bread, more socially acceptable than vodka at breakfast, and possibly the only thing Europe, America, and hipsters can all agree on. I hope you have enjoyed our tour through ancient, medieval, and industrial times. Now we turn to modern beer. But what exactly is modern beer? Who's making it? Who's drinking it? And how did we go from monks in caves to IPAs named after inside jokes? As we conclude, let's crack open the full frothy saga of beer in the modern world, how centuries-old traditions met industrial takeovers, global marketing machines, and finally, the microbrewery revolution. Let's start where modern beer still wears a crown, Europe. From Belgium's funky lambics to Germany's Reinheitsgebot purists, and England's room-temp real ales, European nations have brewing traditions older than most countries. In Belgium, beer isn't just a drink, it's a spiritual event. You've got Trappist monks brewing ales in silence. Gueuze fermented with wild yeasts. And brews that taste like someone stirred in a barn, and a slice of apple pie, in a good way. Meanwhile, in Germany, you still find breweries using open wooden fermenters, or entire towns still brewing under the 1516 Reinheitsgebot purity law, because nothing says tradition like refusing to add coriander for 500 years. In the UK, you've got the real ale movement. These are live beers, unfiltered, unpasteurized, and often hand-pulled from casks. They're finicky. They're delicious. They're kind of like sourdough bread that makes you tipsy. Yes, Europe is the wise old wizard of the beer world, full of mysterious brews, strange customs, and opinions about hops that border on religious doctrine. Now let's cross the Atlantic to a country that loves freedom, football, and fizz, the United States. Once upon a time, pre-prohibition, America was teeming with German, Czech, and British-inspired breweries, most of them small, local, and making hearty, character-rich beers. Then came 1920, and with it, Prohibition, a 13-year government buzzkill that destroyed thousands of breweries. Some converted to making soft drinks, malt syrup, near beer, 0.5% alcohol for legal reasons, or medicinal alcohol because apparently beer is great for your liver if prescribed. Bootleggers watered down beer to maximize profits, creating the thin, weak style that oddly caught on even after Prohibition ended. America came back from a beer blackout and collectively said, "Yeah, I'll take the watery one, thanks." After Prohibition, consolidation became the name of the game. From 1945 to 1980, the number of breweries plummeted. But the few that remained got really, really big. Budweiser, Miller, Coors, Schlitz. Their beers were light, cold, consistent, and best served with TV ads. This era was less about taste and more about marketing muscle. Lager reigned supreme. And for a while, beer diversity in America flatlined. But then, the rebels arrived. In the 1970s and 80s, a quiet revolution began bubbling up in garages, basements, and bathtubs. Homebrewers, weirdos, beer nerds with chemistry sets and zero chill. These pioneers didn't want TV beer. They wanted rich porters, hoppy ales, Belgian-style saisons. Something different. By the 1990s, these small-scale dreams turned into craft breweries. Names like Sierra Nevada, Anchor Steam, New Belgium, Dogfish Head began popping up like wild hops in the concrete jungle. The 2000s saw an explosion. As of 2013, there were over 2,500 breweries in the US. Today, that number is over 9,000. The craft beer boom reshaped American drinking habits, making words like mouthfeel, dry-hopped, and imperial part of everyday vocabulary. It's not just beer. It's an identity. Let's zoom out. Today, beer is global. You've got Japanese breweries perfecting rice lagers, African nations brewing from sorghum and millet, South American cervezas from corn and cassava, Indian lagers built for 110 degrees Fahrenheit afternoons, Chinese mega factories producing more volume than Europe and the US combined. Heineken, Carlsberg, and AB InBev have acquisition tentacles everywhere, buying up regional brands and crafty craft labels to diversify portfolios. But guess what? Local beer traditions are thriving too. In New Zealand, they use Morton Coote's continuous fermentation system, invented in 1953. In Scandinavia, new breweries lean into foraging and ancient Viking techniques. Italy makes award-winning IPAs in converted wine barrels. In Brazil, microbrewers create tropical sours infused with passion fruit and guava. It's like Pokemon, everyone's got their style, and we all want to try them all. Modern beer isn't just a product, it's a science. And consumers, we've officially gone from brewing as survival to brewing as personal branding, but not all is froth and roses in modern beerland. Breweries today face serious challenges. First, market saturation. In places like the US, competition is brutal. A great IPA isn't enough, you need a story, a gimmick, and preferably a pun in your brewery name. Second, supply chain issues. Aluminum cans, carbon dioxide, even glass bottles, all saw price spikes post-2020. Not to mention yeast shortages and delayed shipping. Fourth, big beer muscle. Massive conglomerates still dominate shelf space, stadium taps, and global exports. They acquire popular microbreweries to co-opt the craft movement, while often watering down the flavor. So where are we going? Beer's future looks local, farm-to-keg brewing. Experimental, coffee lagers, peanut butter sours. Sustainable, solar-powered brewing, spent grain baking. Inclusive, beer is for everyone, not just bearded guys in flannel. The beer of the future? It's creative, inclusive, eco-conscious, and maybe just a little bit weird, in the best way. From Bavarian monks to Brooklyn basements, beer has evolved more in the last 200 years than in the previous 2 millennia. It's been banned, industrialized, watered down, rediscovered, and reborn. It's global and local. Ancient and innovative. It's a business, a culture, a community, and, let's be honest, sometimes just a good excuse to sit down with friends and argue about which IPA is too hoppy. So here's to the beer of the modern world. To the brewers, the drinkers, the dreamers, and the purists. To cans and casks and kegs and chaos. To bitter, sweet, funky, fruity, and fabulous. Cheers, or wherever you're watching from, salad. Prost. Opa. Skål. If you enjoyed this global pub crawl through time and foam, hit that like button like you're tapping a fresh keg. Subscribe for more deep dives, and tell us in the comments. What's your go-to modern beer? And which tradition or country do you think has the best brew game today? Until next time, this is Historian's Lullaby, reminding you, history pairs best with a cold one. And some of its best-kept secrets can be found at the bottom of a pint glass. Until next time, I hope you find great rest and wake up fully rejuvenated. Good night.